Okay. Our next presenter is Daniel, who is presented many times already at Open Rules. And Daniel is a consultant who is using different decision management tools for years for real-world applications. So Daniel's view usually comes from the DM trenches, and sometimes it's quite controversial, sometimes it's funny, but it always generates a lot of interest. I hope we will see the same today. Daniel, floor is yours.
Thank you, Jacob. Yeah, good to see you all again. Unfortunately, not live, but perhaps next year. I'm Daniel. I'm mostly a software developer at a German company who fell in love with DMN accidentally about 5 years ago. And since then, we have a few larger projects with DMN and decision management in the last years. And so I want to give an overview of our experience with DMN. These are mostly classic decision management projects, so there's no machine learning or AI things. It's just a classic analysis of decision in the BPMN context mostly. Short agenda. Some words about the company, so you get quite an impression what customers we have. And after this, I mainly will talk about our experience in the last year of having DMN projects which last some years, some are even new. And especially I want to talk about what has been good in the last years and what has, from tools and from the Dmn standard itself, proven great, and what's, in our opinion, still missing a little bit. About our company, we are a German-based company, mostly working in the German area with some airport projects in the world, with some automotive, logistic, and a big part in public sector and mostly government. And that's also the part of the company where I work. So what you see are mostly from governance like custom clearance and so on projects. Yeah, the motivation for this talk was, as I did in the last years, to show how we use really the Dmn standard and the tools out there. So it's not the view of a vendor, it's the view of consulting who have to teach and to bring the DMN on the road. Most of our projects are quite large, so we don't really do the real modeling of the decision and DMNs, but we more train the trainer. So there are large departments in the governance who have to do all the requirements, and mostly we teach them to use DMN to model their decisions. So there's not this classical role of decision engineer or something like this. It's more like a trainer. Yeah, what triggers do we have for our DMN projects? First of all, of course, it's this classic process analysis and modeling. So a customer wants to have a process analysis, and as part of this analysis, you also model the decision task. And yeah, basically, these are the projects where the decision modeling isn't the main part, and often it's not the primary focus. Then, in my opinion, the more interesting projects are these where you analyze really one decision. So our customers have large governance regulators and so on. And there's mostly one question whose answer has to be answered, which is quite complex because there are many rules they have to take care of. And there we do real single decision analysis and modeling using DMN. And from my point of view, that's a project where DMN mostly has best advantages, so it can be used really, really helpful. The third area for decision management is in the context of software modernization. So we often have projects where we have legacy code who has been maintained for 20 years. And in this code, there is a lot of decision logic hard programmed in if-else statements or something like this. And as part of the modernization of the software, the customer has to understand what's happening in this code. And therefore, we extract these decisions out of the, I would call it old code, and make it visible in a decision model. So the requirements for our project, we have technical and non-technical users. So for example, business analysts, users of the software itself. And on the other hand, we have also software developers who are developing the software of the customer. So there's no clear kind of customer who has to use DMN in the project. And as I said, we want to enable the users to model themselves. So in the end, it's our aim that the company or the department doesn't need us anymore to write down their requirements with DMN and with the decision model. But of course, to get there, and that's something, for example, Bruce said, you have to teach them. You can't expect people to understand, feel, and understand decision modeling from day one. It's something we have to teach them, and then they can be enabled to model for themselves. So there are some organizational requirements. First of all, what isn't that bad if especially the business users have some kind of will for logical thinking. So if you don't want to have a logical description, this is really hard to get to feel and to get into DMN itself. Then, of course, and what's at the beginning of all this project a big hurdle is that you have to understand what the meaning of DIDs, because mostly in the past they have written the requirements in prosa, in Word, so long Word documents where they describe their problem or the solution. And with the DID, they have to start thinking, how can I break down a huge decision into little parts which then can be modeled? And from our experience, that's in the beginning really hard, but later on it pays off, because that's the first time they really start to understand what are their requirements, because they have to write them down really precise. Then, of course, you have to learn, feel, and different types of decisions, so decision tables and so on. And in the beginning, a few years ago, we started with decision tables, but really quickly noticed that this isn't enough for the complex logic, and it's mostly too difficult compared when you get into field. So we experience in our project that if people start to understand field, they really want to use it. And with Feel, they really have the opportunity to write down precisely what are their decisions. So what we teach them are, for example, some basic patterns, how you model in Feel and how you have, if you have some kind of decision, what should you do? But in our experience, they really start thinking on their own way. And that's quite interesting to see what solutions comes from people who haven't learned, like most of us, software development, but comes from a business background and start to write down their requirements really logical. Then a really important part are the tools that are required to do so. And first of all, today this might sound a pity, but you have to have a good modeler, which in our opinion has to support the whole Dmn standard. So it's not that useful if you have modelers that have only a subset, for example, just decision tables or even a subset of Feel. You have to use a modeler that has the whole spectrum. Then the second thing, one of the, as we experience, most important thing is a way for the business users to test their model as they are modeling them. So from the beginning, when they make the first decision, they have to be able to model a test for this decision. And this has to be quite easy. It has to be repeatable. Yeah, it has, because they are business users, quite intuitive to do so. But we experience that when people can test their decisions they are writing down, they get a really better understanding of what they are doing. And yeah, for the first time, sometimes they understand what they are writing down in their requirements. Because before they had to write some prosa, then gave it to the software development. They built the software, and then there was a test. And first, that was the first step where you can see, is the logic, is the understanding of the problem right? And with enabling the business users to test their model directly when they're modeling it, is a huge benefit in our point of view. Then a second thing, so as I said, Feel, it is quite a bit complicated to learn it. And therefore, it's really useful for the users to have something like a playground where they don't need a huge model, where they can just test simple functions or so on in Feel to get a better understanding what's happening in their decisions. And we see a lot of our customers using this sometimes just for fun to understand how some of the Feel functions are just working before they try to integrate this into their real models. So this is really helpful. Another importance is a way to document the decision requirement diagram and the decision itself. So you can't, as a business developer, just give the DMN file. So there has to be a way to generate automatic documentation of the DRD, of the decision itself, and mostly of the comment they are writing to these decisions. Yeah, and the last requirement that we see is often our customers have some tools they are set to be used, so you can't change it, and then it's important, and there's a huge lack in this field, that you can integrate your testing tool, your modeler, directly into these tools. For example, if you have one tool to model the BPN diagram, then it must be a way to link this to your decision diagrams and so on. And there's a lot of potential for improvement, especially when you think that DMN is a standard. but many vendors don't support it, or they don't support it in a full way. So there are tools out there that can make DRDs, but then you can't model the decisions itself. So you can link to, I don't know, Excel or something like this. And that simply isn't helpful. So in the last years, when we work with business users and with technical users, there are some interesting quirks which separates these two groups. So for business users, we experience that if they have found one way to model something, they try to do it the same way all the time. So when we first start, we see mostly a lot of decision tables. So the people try to make everything with a decision table. Then they start to understand, well, there's fields, there are contexts. This makes it easy with boxed expression, especially. Then they start one decision where is a huge context in there. Then they start to understand, well, I must separate this in different decisions, and they start to make a lot of decisions. And that's sometimes a long way to get to the right amount of decisions to cut it in really useful pieces. Then, and that's no disadvantage, they want to use their own domain-specific language and terms. And that's something that the DMN and fields support really well. So there's no need for them to, I don't know, write everything with underscore, start something with a capital or non-capital letter. So they can just use their own words with spaces as they want. The last thing we often see is, especially compared to technical users, that the data model itself isn't that consistent. They start to use different words for the same object. They start to have something doubled. And yeah, that's something because these people mostly never had to deal with something like data models as we do as software developers from the beginning of programming. So that's something where you have to look at quite intensely. But also the technical users have some specialties. First of all, when you say that a technical user can make a DMN and a diagram, the first question is, how's the performance when I run this diagram? And that's something they have to see, that even when they have a large model, it can be done with the engines out there quite quickly. But in the beginning, mostly they don't believe us, and they start to do something like shorten the strings, like try to get something in a really complex if then else statement, or using recursions or something like this. And they have to understand that this is not really a problem with DMN. And another subject is that they are concerned to give up their part they have done before. So before there was the business analyst who have written the requirements, and requirement gave to the software developer, and he developed the software. Now with DMN, it isn't really needed for him to write something. He just needs a DMN diagram, an engine, and then he can use it. And that's something he has to understand, that DMN doesn't quit his job. It's only the part that doesn't make much fun for a developer, mostly to write as an else statement that should be done with DMN. So when we look at our project goals, we had this subject earlier also, the execution isn't always the aim. But of course, when you think of DMN, it is executable. Why don't you use it as an execution engine? And since we are using things like test support, where you always need a runnable DMN model, it's something which is quite easier to accomplish, to execute also these models, and not just have a model for documentation. Even also this helps the customers a lot, just to get a standard how they define their decision. Because mostly in the department, there's not just one decision, but a range of. And what we see is that they try to get rules how to define these decisions so that everybody can understand them. And as always, it's a great way to document the decision itself and to get an understanding. As Dennis said yesterday, the possibility to point at one decision and describe what's happening there is a huge benefit compared to you have to look on page 340 to get an understanding of the decision. So about the last years, there have been some versions of the DMN we have used, and we are always interested in the development of the Dmn standard. And what we see is really useful for them. First of all, it's interesting to see are the comment fields. So there was always the requirement that they are able not just to write a comment on a decision, but basically the business users want to write comments on nearly everything if they could. Because even feel and the diagram isn't that self-explaining as some would think. So they want to help the colleagues and themselves for better understanding and write in prosa some small comments on, for example, context and decision tables and so on. And this is something that we see really useful. Then the use of decision services are an interesting phenomenon because we see it more and more often in use. And it's not only because we told them to use it, but some of the customers started to use it for themselves. And on the one hand, I think it's because it makes a better structure of parts of the decision. So especially when you have your output decisions and you have your inputs quite well modeled, then you can see on one view what's happening in this service. And we see many customers using it as some kind of Lego. So they assemble the decision services. The decision services are made by different peoples, for example. And yeah, what we see is that it makes it easier, even with complex decisions, to get an understanding of what's happening there. Another thing that has started to be used quite heavily is the import of models. So in the beginning, we had customers who modeled in one DMN model sometimes hundreds of decisions. And with the ability to import models, it's way easier to them to structure is with other colleagues. So one colleague is in charge for one part of the whole decision and so on. And what we see is the use of imports to have, yeah, I would say a base of data types. So data types which are used throughout the whole department, for example, are modeled just in one model, and this model is imported into the other decision models just to have a whole base of data types which can be used by all of them in the same way. Then something which I had as a software developer some problems in the beginning with is a now function, because I always thought, yeah, it was stateless and side effect free, and now you have something that, let's say, destroyed. And at the beginning, we tried to teach the customer, hey, you can enter it in a input data, the current date or the current time. But it's way more easier to use now. And so I think it's a good reason why it was implemented in the standard. Then something which is really helpful, especially for beginning with feel, are box expressions. For example, if then else and loops and something, because the syntax itself is hard to read for somebody who has no experience with coding or so on. And these box expressions really help to understand what's happening in this, I would call it complex things like loops, like if then else attributes. So this did a lot of improvements. Something that one of our customers is really happy to start using with Dmn 1.4 is other context functions like put and merge. Honestly, we didn't expect it to be so useful for them, but well, in this project, this one customer is really happy to have the opportunity now to use these functions, which is always interesting to see. So we notice that our customers are starting to get interesting in the whole DMN field by themselves, and yeah, start to read, for example, betas of the Dmn standard. So this is quite interesting. And then that's something I had a talk with a few of our customers a few weeks ago, and we talk about what's helpful in DMN and feel, and he said everything that's there. And that was quite interesting because for us, it shows that the Dmn standard, with the range of opportunities it gives the customer, has a really good benefit for him. So on the one hand, it's not too much that he's overwhelmed from the opportunities. But on the other hand, there's also enough space for him to do his job and to model his requirements with it. So yeah, that was quite an interesting sentence. This wouldn't be a proper presentation from me if I didn't point out some things we are missing. First of all, as I said, comment fields could be everywhere. Every attribute could have a comment field, and I promise you there will be a customer who writes comments for these fields. Another subject that came up is the inheritance in data types. And I personally don't know whether I want to see it in the DMN or not. I can understand that it's at some point easier to structure your data, but I don't know whether it would be too complex for most of the customers if they have this opportunity. But it's interesting that this idea came up. Then, as I said, tests are really important. We say a DMN model without test cases is worth nothing, because only with these test cases you can say that this model does what it has to do. And yeah, no, it's not part of the OMG and so on to take care of test cases and so on. But in our opinion, the test cases and the DMN model belongs together. And so we are working also in our tools to make it as an extension like Trisotech does it, for example. Then an interesting subject was some of our customers asked for a random function. And yeah, first of all, it's something like with now. I would say it's not needed, but it's interesting that they think about already this type of new functions. This could be useful. And another thing, as I said, the customer starts to use the import of models quite heavily. And a general problem since the beginning is the understanding of the inputs. So when we start with modeling, customers make two inputs, give it the same name, and they're expecting it to be one input. And then you have to say, no, you have to make a line between one of them. And with imported inputs, it's even more impossible to use these inputs in a useful way. So there we see a lack on making use of the inputs easier in a more business-friendly way. And the last subject, this came up last week. So with these big departments, they have separated, so the customer has separated. Some people are responsible for just the overview of the decision. So they say these are the inputs, this has to be the output. And then they give this to some other colleagues to make the real modeling. And then there was a question, how can we take care that the modeler doesn't change the input that's needed or doesn't change the output that's from this model? And isn't there any way to say we have this model and some parts of this model can't be changed by another person? So he just could add more decisions or could add more data types, but he couldn't, for example, erase data types or manipulate them. And yeah, we haven't found really a solution for this, but I think it's an interesting topic to think about, whether it's possible to support the modeler in some way. Then, as I mentioned, tools are really important for us. And we had a long journey finding right tools that are useful for us. So this is just some examples we are using as open source tools, because yeah, the customer mostly want open source tools. So first of all, there's a Cogito modeler from Red Hat, which has been really great over the last releases. Then, for example, there's also the Camunda modeler, who doesn't support the whole DMN, but we often have customers who use the Camunda engine and BBM.io, so they also want to use the Camunda modeler to have it all from one hand. Then the rules engine itself, this is our main engine we support when we talk about executions model. It's used in our test tool, it's used in production. And yeah, at this point, you really have to say Red Hat did a great job also with being one of the first to implement new standards of the DMN directly. And yeah, we really like this engine. Then, as I mentioned, there's a need for the opportunity to play with field to get a better understanding. And yeah, I've seen different playgrounds. We have developed one. I've seen Nico from Red Hat, who is the developer of BPM.io, also did one as a side project. So we see there's also in the market seems to be some interest in these tools, even as if we heard in the presentations before, field isn't only useful for DMN, but it can be used, for example, in BPMN, you see Camunda using it, for example, in their engine now. So there's a big need for tool support with field. Then, as I mentioned, the testing tools. Because we hadn't had one, we started building our own open source project, DecisionCAMP, which has an integration of the Cogito modeler and an integration of the Druge engine to enable users to write test cases while they're modeling in the modeler. Then, I mean, not everybody is interested in reading the whole specification of the DMN to understand all the functions that are available. So I think Matteo did a great job by writing a DMN handbook where you have a short overview of the functions that are given with DMN and a short example. So this is really helpful. And last but not least, the TCK, because when we start this project and we have the decision about which engine to use, this is always a good point to show the customer here. There's a test case. You can see which engine support which part of the DMN, and we use it a lot. So then what's still, in our point of view, missing in open source tools is, first of all, a better way to see comments and to handle comments in the diagrams. And an interesting part is the opportunity to execute parts of a model. Because if you want to run your test, you always have to have a model that is executable completely. But sometimes, people start to write a small decision which isn't already finished. And therefore, we are working on a solution that you can say, this and this part of the model has to be executed, and the rest can be ignored, first of all, until it's fully modeled. And yeah, as I mentioned, there are large departments with groups of teams who work together on one model. So a better opportunity for collaborative modeling, like we see it in other tools, like we see it with Google Docs or something like this. This would also be quite helpful. So to come to an end, in our experience, decision model projects are really independent projects, and you don't need a BPMN project therefore, but it's really a great way to get a better understanding of different decisions who are difficult, who are complex, and you see much faster results when using DMN and decision modeling than using the old way with old requirements. And the next thing, as I said, the standard, if you only have the standard, it wouldn't be helpful. So you have to have tools that support really business users, that are business users friendly. And most of all, that doesn't look like they are an IDE or they are using some code there. Because as we have a lot of discussion about low code, our experience is that the business users, they don't want to code. And as long as you don't tell them that field is something like low code, or I don't know, most of all see it is in a way it's like Excel. But if you would tell them, hey, this is code you're writing there, I think they wouldn't be really happy that they just do code instead of their business. But in general, and perhaps in the last year I wouldn't have said this, in our experience, the DMN and especially the tools are developing a really good direction to make it useful. You have to understand that feel, and that's also the title of this presentation, you can't expect you show a customer here's feel and it's super and you can use it, and then he understands the benefits of it and is ready to use it. It is a long way to teach customers the use and the benefits of DMN, of feel. But in our project, as we have some of them working for some years now, we see a really benefit, and also the customer sees a real benefit. And we also see really an excitement of using DMN, because that's really the way what we hear a lot from our customers. It's the first time they really understand their requirements they're writing and their decisions they're doing. So yeah, from my point of view, it's hard to sell DMN projects. We also make this experience, but I think it's really worth it. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much, Daniel. That's really interesting to see some of these practical applications. I think many of the people who are attending here at DecisionCAMP or doing presentations are vendors, and it's not quite the same when you're actually doing the projects.
Yeah.
Had a question from Jan about a typical application. What does one of your typical applications look like in terms of the subject matter, the size, and so on, just to give us a little bit of context?
Mostly, for example, it's in customer service, calculating customs duty, or checking the amount of positions in these custom goods. So there's a really complex regularities, because it's from the EU and from the German government, and it's a lot of execution. So as you might imagine, when you import something, every item has to be checked. And so we see really large, complex decisions that has to be made during this process.
Yes, no, that makes sense. And that's why DMN brings such value to these, yeah, rather than having it all in code.
And Jan asked about size. How many decision variables in average you have? How many decision tables in average decision model?
It's hard to say. I would say between 15 to 20 decisions. But as I mentioned, with the use of these decision services, it's hard to say really, because they are starting to integrate them in more than one decision. So yeah, I would say sometimes, of course, there are 30 decisions, but there's always quite a complex context in these decisions. So the context itself isn't that simple. Or I couldn't remember that we have a decision which is just one decision table. So there's a lot of complexity in this decision.
Rimantis had a question about just his personal experience with things like the date and time functions, like now and today, that these are a real problem when you're managing business rules and decisions. You can see his whole question on Slack there, but just you run into problems with testing and simulation, and he talks about things like reproducibility, item potency, data consistency issues, and so on, because you'll get the multiple calls to the same function will give you different values because things are changing. And he just wanted to know, how do you address these issues? And he said in their case, they just avoid functions like that, and they model concepts of current date and current time explicitly instead.
Yes, it's something we make our customer aware of, that especially if you want to reproduce some decision. For example, there was a problem with some goods and they have to do the same again, then they have to take care that there is no side effect or like now. But in most of the use cases, it's not that problem at all.
Right. Yes, you'd hope you wouldn't have things that would be dependent on it being exactly 3:04 on a Wednesday when something happens, but you can get all kinds of sort of problems, like sort of glitches with the time and date functions. Those can be the worst, especially when you're going across time zones. It can be particularly bad. So Hans had a question about data models. He pointed out that OMG is not only specified CMMN, BPMN, and DMN, but also UML. And would be a solution to make use of the part of UML that's good at defining data, such as in specialization. So this would require some tool support, but what's your thoughts on using UML as part of this?
Yeah, in general, modeling the data types is something we also have our problems with to find a good modeling language, therefore. And from my point of view, that's something that's perhaps not only missing in DMN, but in the whole BPMN, DMN world.
Yes.
But in my experience, when we had BPMN projects, the data wasn't that important. And first with DMN projects where you have an input and you have to say this and this and this are my data types that get in, people start to think about data model, especially users, because in the, I would say, old days, that was something that has to be done by the software developer. And there I see really a lack in the standard. And I don't know whether UML in some kind of would be a solution, but yeah, there's a need, I think.
Right. James pointed out that they just use ERDs to group the elements that they need in the decision. So the decision model first, and then an ERD to represent the data that they need.
Yeah.
Denis said there's a new standard in finalization at OMG called SDMN, Shared Data Model and Notation, that is hoping to address that. So maybe we'll be hearing about that next year.
Yeah, I will take a look. So quite interesting.
Great. Okay, do we have any other questions or comments for Daniel right now? We're going to be having a panel coming up, so it's I think as soon as